Ari. It's a tremendous honor for me to be able to share with you and take this time to spend with you. I like Ari said, I did grow up in Los Angeles, and so speaking to people on the West Coast, just looking at you, I can kind of like already feel the West Coast vibe, coming through your video windows. I want to thank Mark Michael Epstein for the introduction and for giving me an opportunity to speak. And of course, this class being in honor of my dear friend and colleague, Rabbi Dr. Rafi Zarum, is a thrill to me. I mean, he is definitely one of my most favorite people, favorite scholars, and he never ceases to really invigorate and enthrall me in his teaching. So I'm honored. I hope I can do justice to his name being part of this, being part of this. So I'll get right into it. The title of this talk is why God favors covenant, whether you spell it with the U or without the U. And the bottom line is that it seems that God seems to have a thing for what we call in Hebrew berit, or in English covenant. And so I want to think on that a little bit with you, and to consider perhaps some of its implications for us, and what it might mean for us and for our lives, and again, with whatever it is, how it is that we might individually relate to it. To open with, it is important to recognize that when we talk about God, we are talking about an entity that we tend to recognize almost, as a given, as an entity that is utterly free, right? That God is not governed by anything outside of him. As a matter of fact, in normative Jewish thought, there is no outside of him. He is as outside as one gets. And obviously, whenever we talk about these things, we're borrowing terms because we're not talking about spatial insides and outsides, but whatever kind of virtual, qualitative insides and outsides there are. But ultimately, we recognize that God is the ultimate entity, and that there is nothing greater than God. And if there was something greater than God, then that's what we would be talking about when we use the word God. So in the in the way that Anselm would have said it, the greatest conceivable being, or the way that Maimonides presents it at the opening of his book, the Mishneh Torah, that God is Matsui Rishon, which literally means primal existence, right? The very first entity. And talking about the very first entity, we're not going to dive into the nuts and bolts of what this entity must be for us, because the reality is that whatever this entity is, we don't really have the terms to be able to speak about it. And whatever it is that we do say about it, we are borrowing. But when we do borrow, we recognize that from our perspective and our thinking, this entity that we call God is unencumbered, is utterly free, is not governed by anything external to it. And what that means is that there are no rules for God. And that's something a little bit more difficult to swallow, because we like to believe that God should run by rules, because otherwise, how are we supposed to manage with him? He's uncontrollable, and it makes things very uncomfortable to think that God doesn't need to follow any rules. But when we think about it objectively, realistically, it would make perfect sense that this entity that we call God, this Matsui Rishon, this primal existence, this first entity, this completely unencumbered entity, shouldn't necessarily have any rules that it must follow, because otherwise the rules would be God. They would ultimately impose upon this entity what this entity is, and they would be beyond or above or the highest level. And then that's what we mean when we call God. So there's a certain recognition that when we talk about God, God is utterly free and is not required in any way, nor is in any way, shape, or form, existentially or otherwise, to follow anything. We recognize God to be infinite, and therefore able to do whatever it is that he wants at any time that he wants, for any reason that he wants. And even when we talk about reasons when it comes to God, that's also a bit of a misnomer, because when we say that there is a reason for something, we would mean that the reason is motivating us to do something. We can't talk about that with regards to God, because what would be motivating him? It would be external to him, above, beyond him. So there must be that whatever it is that God does is spontaneous. Now, the truth of the matter is we could spend the entire time tossing that idea around. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it before you. I'm going to present it to you. I'm going to lay it there. And we're going to take that as a given for the class. If that's a difficult given, then I apologize. But it is, in normative Judaism, the given. And that's the perspective that I'm offering you tonight. Or I suppose, what did you say? It was noon, right? So it's not tonight. So you'll notice that my windows are not, it's nighttime outside. It's about 8:13 here. But if that is the case, if we are to recognize that God is unencumbered, utterly free, doesn't run by rules, it also means that for all intents and purposes, God is unreliable. Because there's nothing holding him. There's nothing forcing him, demanding him to keep or maintain anything as it is in a default setting. Now, it's interesting because this is also tradition among the Talmudic sages. There's a tradition that on the first verse of, or one of the first verses of creation, when it says, and it was evening, and it was morning, first day, and it was evening, and it was morning, second day. Well, it says it on the first day. In Hebrew, it's Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker. It was evening and it was morning. Rabbi Abhu, as we call him among the Sephardi tradition, otherwise Ashkenazim usually call him Rabbi Abahu. Well, he has something that he says in the Midrash. He says, well, from that Vayhi Erev Vayhi Boker, without telling us, it was evening and it was morning, without telling us what evening and morning is, it just uses it as a given, as a term that's been around. Well, he says what that teaches us is that there were mornings and evenings before that. And what that tells, and he makes a big jump. And then he says, you know what that teaches us about God? And Rabbi Abhu is a very famous Talmudic scholar, sage. He says, you know what that teaches us about God? It teaches us that he was Borei Olamot Maharivan, which means he created worlds and destroyed them regularly. That's an astonishing thing to say. But that's what he says. He says that God, he just would put things into motion. He'd run simulations and then, take them out. Run them and take them out. Run them and take them out. And that lends itself to this kind of randomness that we might expect if we weren't coming to it with presuppositions of an infinite, unencumbered, utterly free God. As a matter of fact, even the creation story that we believe is still running almost didn't make it. I mean, it gets through by the skin of its teeth, doesn't it? I mean, if we think about the reading of our parashiyot, we're not far off from Bereshit, and Bereshit starts off with a tremendous amount of fanfare. I mean, it's so dramatic. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it carries on with this epic, dialogue of how these things were brought to being. And we get so caught up in that we sometimes forget that by the end of the reading of that week, everything crashes and burns. I mean, the entire project of creation is a failure by the end of the reading of Parashat Bereshit. To the point that it says, God says, I don't like it. I don't like it very much. I think I'm taking it out. I think I'm going to destroy it. Right? So it seems like he's just continuing with the way that he's been doing, except for the fact that there's this one chap down there named Noach that seems to find favor in God's eyes, and God decides to take him through on an ark. But destruction occurs. And it seems that this is indeed the way that God tends to run, because if you're familiar with the stories, and I urge you to go back to see them, God, even within covenant, and we're going to get to covenant in a moment, but even within covenant, being that he's God, and being that being encumbered is not his fundamental nature, he tends to read the covenants in a very liberal way. So we'll have a look at that. And what I mean by liberal is he will allow himself the greatest leeway in the covenants. But let's have a look, shall we? Because it seems that in order to be able to rein himself in, if we could say, God chooses covenant to do so. And he only does so in order to be able to have some level of consistent interaction with these strange bipeds that sprouted up on this arbitrary planet, revolving around this star, of which there are trillions and trillions and trillions like it. Something about these bipeds, as far as Torah speaks to us, interests God. He recognizes that it might be worth investing with these creatures. And to the point that he is willing to bind himself, if you will, I mean, if we could say such a thing, but he's willing to bind himself so that he can maintain some consistent level of interaction with them. And that binding starts with Noah. Let's have a look. I'll put it up for you as well. I hope everyone can see. Yeah. So I'm going to go down here to the sorry, moving the actual thing. There we go. We'll do that. Okay. So this over here is in Genesis 9, verse 8-13. I'm going to read it in Hebrew, but the translation is right next to it. Vayomer Elohim el Noach ve'el banav ito lemor. Right now, this is taking place. This dialogue between God and Noah is taking place after the flood, not before the flood. And Noah does something, right? Noah decides to put up an offering on an altar for God. And the sages say that, it would have been a good idea if he tried to do that before the flood. Maybe that would have helped things. But no, he waits until after the flood to do this. And it seems to have some level of appeasement to God. And God interacts with this human called Noah on planet Earth and responds to this offering of appeasement that Noah brings before God. And he says to him and to his children, he says, Va'ani, as for me, Noah, hineni mekim et briti techem. I am going to establish my covenant with you. Ve'et zarachem acharechem, and with your seed after you, literally. Ve'et kol nefesh haya asher itechem, not only with you, but with the animals. Because, I was thinking about it, and poor animals. I mean, just because you guys mess up, why should I take them out? So they're just as important. I'm going to have a covenant with them as well. As a matter of fact, I'm having a covenant with all of the flesh that inhabits the earth. And that means that I am binding myself to a promise, to a commitment. And that commitment is V'akimoti et beriti techem over here, and I'm going to uphold my covenant with you. V'lo yikaret kol basar od. And all flesh will no longer be cut down. There's a little asterisk, mimeh hamabul, with a flood. All right, so he keeps things open. Of course, there's all other manner of calamity that could happen, but with a flood. We're not taking everything out with a flood. I'm not going to do that anymore. And I'm going to give you a sign so that you know that I've established this covenant. I'm going to put my bow into the heavens, within the clouds. My, what do you call it? A rainbow. That's my bow. That's going to, from now on, be the sign of my covenant. Now, recognizing that God is utterly free, completely infinite, not encumbered by rules, this is highly irregular. Because what it means is that he is, for all intents and purposes, in order to maintain some connection and relationship with humanity, which seems to be of interest to him, he is willing to forego some of his godly liberties and to lock himself into a consistent relationship. Now, being God, when he does commit, you can take it to the bank. I mean, once he makes a promise, the promise is a promise. And so you have Moses telling us things like, Lo ish el vichazev. I mean, God's not like a human, fickle like that, and where he just, changes his mind right and left. Uben adam v'it neham, and, human beings that kind of, change their mind every other day. Ha'u amar v'lo ya'aseh. I mean, when we talk about God, if he says he's going to do something, he's not going to do it. Diber lo yikemena. If he speaks it, will he not uphold it? All right, so Moses is highlighting over here in the book of Numbers that when God does make an oath, when he does commit, you can take it to the bank. Samuel says the same thing to Saul in different words. Gam netzach Yisrael, the eternal one of Israel, lo yishaker, velo yinahem. He doesn't lie, and he doesn't just change his mind when he commits to something. Kilo adam hu linahem, right? He keeps comparing it to human beings who seem to be quite fickle in that manner, in that nature. So here you have it. I mean, God is establishing covenant. And he does it, it seems, to lock himself in to relationship. And what we see from that is, number one, that God is willing to forego his liberties. And what ultimately matters is relationship with these human beings that he's created on earth. And even if we look at it from our perspective, we recognize that it needs to happen in terms of covenant. Because without that, it is essentially an aberration to consider God as an entity that should be consistent in any way. He is utterly free and can do whatever it is spontaneously, whenever it is that he wishes. The one who recognizes this in the Bible, incidentally, we're not going to get into the depths of this because we don't have time, but the one who recognizes this in the Bible is Bilam. There's a whole parasha for him, as a matter of fact, called Parashat Balak. And he's not of the nation of Israel, but what he does recognize is that God is utterly unpredictable, and he's comfortable with this. And because of his comfort with this, he has a relationship with God, because God basically says to Bilam, you get me. You don't project things onto me. You don't expect me to live into your confines in any way. To the point that the Talmud says it's such an important point that Bilam recognized about God that we should read that entire parsha in our daily Kriyat Shema, in our daily readings of the Shema Yisrael. But because that would cause us way too much time, it would take way too much time to do, the rabbis decided, you know what, we'll leave it out. But the very contemplation of including it that way tells us how important the concept is. That we must understand that when we talk about God in his essence, there's nothing encumbering him. And that covenant tells me that he is willing to encumber himself for the purpose of relationship, which tells me further that the purpose of relationship is extremely important to him for some reason. So now, the covenant that he has with Noah is a covenant that he has with the entirety of humanity. And for the people of Israel, it goes further. Because there is, in our tradition, as far as Torah is concerned, a covenant that is established with our forefather, Abraham, and a covenant that is later established with the entire nation. As a matter of fact, being that this class is in honor of Rabbi Zarum, I don't know if you've seen this, but this is one of the greatest works that I've seen him do. He's just writing a book now. He's just completed writing a book. I don't know if you know that, but I mean, if you're familiar with him and interacting with him often, then you will know that he's been busy over the last year and change writing a book, which I'm very excited about. But this is something else that he did. He wrote this. I don't know if you've ever seen it, called Torah L'Am. Have you seen this? Have you ever done this course with him? phenomenal piece of scholarship here, in where he basically summarizes the entire Hebrew Bible, the 5 books of Moses, in various ways. It's a phenomenal handbook. And one of the things that he puts out in the book is an entire section on covenant. And he outlines the covenant in Torah. There are 3 major covenants in Torah: first, second, and third. The first, of course, is with Noah. The second was with Abraham. And the third is with the nation itself of Israel. And so let's have a look at those, because it seems that God further binds himself whenever there is interest in maintaining consistent interaction and relationship, and where he will need to follow a consistent path of behavior. He does so by making an oath, and for all intents and purposes, locking himself in to that commitment. So the first that we've just recently read, as Ari said, is with Abraham. And that there's about 70 places throughout the Torah that covenant is mentioned, but this one is the one that he establishes with Abraham. And that's in Genesis 17. And he says over here, again, "V'hakimoti et biriti," this hakimoti, I will uphold. It will stand, from the word kam in Hebrew, to stand. I will uphold my covenant. Bini ubenecha uben zaracha acharecha ledorotam lebrit olam. He's talking to Abraham over here. And he says to Abraham, I'm going to hold my covenant with you, with your children after you, and your seed for all time, for all their generations, an eternal covenant. V'yod lecha Elohim ulzaracha acharecha. I will be for you a God, Abraham. That's very different than Noah. The covenant with Noah is just, I'm going to maintain the consistency of life on earth. You don't have to worry that I'm going to wipe you out anymore. This, God is saying, it's much more personal. This is about you, Abraham. It's about you, your children, and that I'm committing to be their God. I'm going to watch them and care for them as a God to them. I'm going to give them a place on this planet that they can live as a nation. I'm going to give you the land that you are sojourning in now, land of Canaan. And he says to Abraham, God says to Abraham, you keep my covenant, Abraham. This is now a dual covenant. You, your seed that comes after you, for all their generations. And this, he says, you are to perform circumcision as the sign, right? So the first sign was the rainbow. Here, the sign of the covenant is circumcision on the males. Incidentally, the Talmud asks, what about the women? And there is a line in the Talmud that says, Isha kimahula damya in Aramaic. It means that a woman is already considered as though she is within covenant. She needs no editing. She is fine as she is. It is the men that need the adjustment, if you will. Later on, the covenant is taken even further to be able to establish the nation as an entity that God interacts with and will maintain for all time. And the Torah is given. Notice, interestingly, there is never a mention of the Torah to Abraham, not once. It only comes out when the covenant needs to be established with the nation. And that happens first on Mount Sinai, after, not at the 10 Commandments, but after the Parashat Mishpatim, where all the issues of civil law are put out to the people. The covenant is established with them, and it is the only place in the Torah where the Torah itself is called the Book of Covenant. Vaikach Sefer HaBerit, and Moses took the Book of Covenant. Vaikra be'oznei ha'am, he read it in the ears of the nation, and all of the nation responded after hearing that. All that God says, na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will listen. It is reiterated, re-established at the plains of Moab, just as before Moses' death, and that happens in Deuteronomy 29. And you can see here, he says, You are now entering into the covenant of the Lord your God and his oath that the Lord your God is establishing with you today. So what are the implications of that? Recognize that God favors covenant because it is something that he recognizes or establishes as a commitment for relationships. Because in his default, relationships are not necessarily something that he is open to. But there's something about the human beings on earth that emerge with consciousness. And consciousness means that they are not only aware, but they are aware that they are aware. And they are aware of themselves and of the universe in which they live and inhabit, and they can be aware of its maker. And that is particularly attractive, if you will, to God. And so it's in that recognition of this emergence of these human beings that God responds and interacts and has a developing, not only a mutual, but a developing specified covenant that he establishes. So whereas the first covenant is a covenant with all of humanity, it becomes more narrow and it becomes a covenant with Abraham and his offspring and covenant with his nation, the nation that emerges after that. Michael Wishegrod points out an interesting point with regards to that, because that's obviously an element of terrible concern for us for all of history being chosen. And one of the things that he points out in his book, The Body of Faith, which I think is a lovely book. I recommend it if you haven't read it. It's a wonderful treatment of God's relationship with Israel and with Abraham, is that in the covenant of God to Abraham, it teaches that God is interested not only in universal relationship, but in specified relationship. In other words, God does not only have love for humanity simply because they exist, but God also loves individuals because of who they are, individual, specific love. And that is expressed in God's election of Abraham. The way that Wishegrod puts it is he says God falls in love with Abraham. And that's one of the reasons why you don't see that there's any backstory presented in the Torah at all. All it is that suddenly he falls in love. Well, now anybody that's fallen in love, you try and give reasons for it and start to delineate, well, why it is that this person means to me what they mean. It always ends up breaking down. I don't know, it just is. I love the person. What can I tell you? But that's the way that it's presented. And so this covenant is established in a way that God says, I am going to bind myself because it matters that much to me to live throughout the generations with you in a consistent promise and commitment. And that indeed is the way that our people have looked at this relationship with God for most of our history. And so there's some interesting points that we recognize as a result of this. I'll look at some of it with you, the ways that I've seen, that I've liked. So there's these lovely lines that the sages bring. One in Sanhedrin, and it says, Hata Yisrael, because of this covenant, if Israel sins, Amar Rabbi Abba bar Zavda, Afal Pisha Hata Yisraelhu. Well, that might be that they might have had a misstep, lacked aim, missed the mark on certain things. But no matter what it is that they do, they are Israel. And that never changes. And that never changes because of the covenant. One who is a member of the nation of Israel, that is in covenant with God, can never stop being a member of the nation of Israel. And that is the fundamental truth. And we know that that's true even with regards to the legal implications. That once a person is a member of the nation, a person is always a member of the nation, no matter the person's beliefs, no matter the person's deeds, no matter what it is that they do. And so Herman Wouk, who recently passed away, which is very sad, although he did live to 101. If you've read The Will to Live, I've read Maybe This Is My God by Herman Wouk, or The Will to Live On. Highly recommended both of them. If you haven't read them, absolutely do. He writes, Abraham's covenant is renewed between the Creator and all Israel, a commitment that for the faithful among us is binding to this hour. It's something that lives in our people. And even though it is a covenant and we're both kind of locked into it, as it were, he points out the fact that comparisons fall away when one comes to the literary prophets. There's no parallel in the other cultures to the intimate, if rocky, relationship of the Lord God and his people. It is one of the unique attributes of being in covenant with God. And so what that means is there's something about the nature of Jewish life in which this covenant runs and how it manifests within us. We're an indestructible people because of it. I think that Wishgrad says it very beautifully. I want to read it with you. He says, there thus came about a visible presence of God in the universe, first in the person of Abraham, and later his descendants, as the people of Israel. This people is, on the one hand, like any other people in the world. It has its territory, its ups and downs, its villains. It has its history, its ups and downs, its villains and heroes. On the other hand, it's unlike any other people in the world. From the human point of view, the dissimilarity is puzzling. Above all, it seems to be an indestructible people. While all the peoples of the ancient world have long disappeared, the Jewish people continues to live and has lived for 2,000 years without a homeland, dispersed over most of the globe. They add up from the biblical perspective to the conclusion that God is with this people in some special way, that they are peculiarly his property, and that the fate of God in the human universe seems to be tied to this people. And I must say that living here in London, if any of you have been here, and if you haven't, try to make it, put it on your bucket list. I try to visit the British Museum at least once a year. Rafi Zaroum, I think, has given virtual tours in the British Museum. There's nobody like Rafi Zaroum who gives you a sense of Jewish history as he tours the British Museum. But being an empire once upon a time, the British Museum is replete with all ancient civilizations and artifacts. And every room that you visit in that museum, whether it's ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt or ancient Rome or Greece, as a Jewish person, you walk through that place and you realize that each and every single one of these rooms and the artifacts and the people of whose story it tells are footnotes to our history. And what Torah teaches us about that is in no small part because of the covenant within which God bound himself and allowed himself to relinquish liberties that were, again, as I borrow the terms, rightfully his as God, to do whatever it is that he wishes, whenever he wishes, as he wishes. And so the covenant is, at the end of the day, a statement of love, a statement of meaning and value to God. It is as if God says, I am God, and I can do whatever it is that I wish to do and answer to absolutely no one. And instead, what I will do is establish an oath, and I will have to answer to you, and I will be consistent and committed to you. And in that covenant, it will herald and express and signal that I am interested in relationship. And I am interested in commitment, and I will lock myself in even when I wish to get out of it. When the going gets tough, I will hold. And of course, the nature of covenant is two-sided. It's bilateral, our covenant. And it's been a very major part of what it means to be Jewish throughout the ages. Because we do have to ask ourselves one way or another, what will we do with that? Can't pretend it's not there. We can either decide to disregard it or to be faithful to it or somewhere in between, but nonetheless, it is very much a part of our heritage and a part of our story. And so God, I might suggest, favors covenant because there's something about it that expresses a favoring of commitment and relationship and sharing. And even when the going gets tough, we hold. And that's essentially it in a nutshell, what I wanted to just present as a thought with you, given that we're reading these things now. But I do highly recommend the books, the book from Wook and the book from Wishgrad. I think they'll complement these ideas fairly well. And I thank you again for your wonderful time and attention and for giving me this Sunday, this hour on a Sunday to share with you. And if there are any questions, very happy to address them if I can.
Thank you. I'll open up the chat. You can chat questions. People have already asked questions. So my first question is, I always thought it was Rabbi Rafi Zarum, and now you say Zarum. So now I feel so bad that I've introduced him incorrectly.
You don't have to feel bad. I'm saying it in the more ethnic, original way, but people call it Zarum. It's fine.
Okay. I also wanted to mention that one of our donors, Rena Konheim's on, I believe it was her birthday just recently. So I want to say happy birthday.
Well, happy birthday.
So let's talk about covenant. Is covenant a contract or is it different than a contract?
Well, I mean, I think it's inclusive of contract, but I think it's more than that, right? It is a commitment of action in which a contract can be quite dry, right? And where, parties are required to engage in certain behaviors, but the nature of this contract is quite personal. So you see over and over again in which God says, I will be for you a God, you will be for me a people. As a matter of fact, I didn't put it on the source sheet, but when you read in Parashat Yitro, the giving of the 10 Commandments, before the 10 Commandments are given, it's a remarkable reading. I mean, if you'd like, I can kind of pull it up, but God says to Moses, he says, before you say anything that is a commandment, I need you to give them this preamble. And you must say this preamble to them exactly in the way that I tell you, so that it frames everything that comes after it. And it's a few lines. And what it says is, I took you out of Egypt on the wings of eagles. I brought you to me. You will be a treasure to me among all peoples. I will be for you God, and you will be for me a people. And so, yes, it certainly includes contract, but it's quite personal in its nature. And so it's requesting a personal investment and commitment of care for all intents and purposes. And so we see later on in the prophets, there's a lot of chastisement that goes because there's no care. So you see that Jeremiah and Isaiah, Isaiah is a befivu bisfatav kibiduni. They've respected me with their lips. They've given me lip service. Velibor hak mimeni, but their hearts are nowhere to be found. They're very far from me. And there's these insistences on God that there should be care that is manifest, not just action and dry agreements. Yeah, I would say.
Would you mind unsharing the screen just to remind you?
Sorry about that.
So Rochelle asked a question that I was thinking about as well, which is, whether you call it a contract or more a covenant, which is larger than a contract. What happens when our side does not follow this covenant, which is, and the ramifications seem pretty obvious if you read the prophets. Yeah. Does that mean, like, if someone or we break this agreement, does that mean that God will punish us, or that God is out of the contract or out of the covenant? And if it's God out of the covenant forever, or just a period of time?
Thank you for the question. Well, again, what I answer is only in terms of how it is the Torah presents it to us. But the Torah presents it in the following way. Breach of contract incurs punishment, possibly, and sometimes quite severe punishment. And even though there is a promise to the nation of Israel, it doesn't mean that there are no casualties. As a matter of fact, the casualties are quite clearly and specifically outlined in Torah. But what it does not include is a dissolution or an absolvement of the covenant. It is an unconditional covenant because it starts with Abraham, like I said, with God kind of coming into it unconditionally. There's no motivating factors. It's love. And at Sinai, it's bilateral. It's offered to the people and people enter into it. And so there is nothing that God or the people can do to abrogate the covenant. And that means that there's no outing. There's no out of it, not for God, not for the people. And that also means that, like I said, once a Jew, always a Jew. So there is a limit to how much, the misbehavior or the lack of consistency or commitment to the covenant can incur response that is perhaps punishment, but it never breaks. It's an indestructible covenant and therefore an indestructible people. Oh, I don't hear. Are you on mute or? I'm sorry. Yeah, you're on mute, Ari. Sorry.
Sorry, that was my fault. You'd think after 319 programs, I would get it right, but
it happens to me all the time.
So isn't there a covenant that God has that you didn't mention with the non-Jewish members of the world, i.e. most of the world, the 7 Noahide laws?
So it's an interesting question. Those are, in our tradition, right, the 7 Noahide laws, in our tradition, are laws, but not covenant. In other words, there's an expectation, again, in our tradition that, and remember that these laws are only laws that are expected when a Gentile lives under the legislation and government of Israel, right? So when a Gentile is living under the government of Israel, right, as outlined in Torah, there's a requirement. They do not have to take on all of the laws of the Torah. They can live in Israelite territories and be protected by Israelite army and supported by Israelite healthcare. Don't laugh, it's not a joke. There's actual discussion of healthcare in the Talmud, basic support for the citizens of the Israelite nation. But they are not required to keep the 613 commandments of the Torah. They are only required to keep 7 laws. But that is not something that is required within its own separate covenant. It is within the covenant of Israel.
As an aside, people have asked how to get a copy of Rabbi Zarum's book that you showed.
You need to ask Rafi.
Okay.
You have to ask, because I know that he has a few copies, but I don't know that he's sending them out en masse, although I keep telling him that he should, because I just think it's absolutely brilliant. I feel like any person that studies Bible at all should have one of these. I mean, literally, the cover just fell off when I was showing it to you, because I use it so often as a handbook. I mean, it's just a wonderful compendium. Yeah.
And then some people have, since God is non-binary, they're wondering why you refer to God as male.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do that only out of habit. Yeah, so I could say they, perhaps, when I talk about God. But obviously, God has no genitalia, and like I said, there is nothing that we can say about God that is accurate. Everything that we say is only borrowed terms, and so we tend to refer to God as a male. It's historically traditional, but again, doesn't describe him in reality in any way.
And people ask, well, it seems like we, particularly Jewish people, but humanity and the Jewish people, get a lot out of this covenant. But what does God get?
So it's an interesting thing. Like I'm suggesting, if one were to look at the act of creation and we recognize that there are no motivations for God, we could only look at it as a spontaneous act. And therefore, to look at any quote unquote meaning in it, we would simply have to look at what's happening here. And it seems that what's happening is that God is sharing existence. And so creation, for all intents and purposes, is an act of sharing. It's the fundamental nature of creation. And so I don't know that we could say that God gets anything out of it, as though there is something lacking in him that requires filling. But there is somehow this spontaneous expression on his part that aims to share, and that the vindication, the fruition, the wholeness of that act is to do so, and covenant helps that happen. because it binds relationship and sharing as opposed to making the interactions random and fickle and inconsistent. And that's the way that I tend to look at it.
I don't think covenant is really spoken about much in the modern Jewish world.
It isn't.
And so.
But I think it's the elephant in the room, frankly. I think that it is so prominent. Like I said, 70 times in the Bible it's spoken about. Rafi has an entire section of it in his book. Wishgrad, the entire book, is based on that. For me, it is the most central idea of Judaism. And I think that we miss it whenever, I think anything else, again, this is only Joe Dweck's perspective. I think anything else that we speak about, whether it is ethics, morality, tikkun olam, Zionism, anything else that we talk about is only peripheral to that. Because when you look at the text, that is the only thing that is the constant refrain over and over. It literally is like essentially the last thing on Moses' lips. It's the first thing on God's lips when he talks to Abraham. It bookends the entire Bible. So yes, I think you're right, Ari. It is rarely spoken about in Judaism today, but I think that it is it's something that we miss that is profoundly central.
Has God fulfilled the covenant? Because I reread the Brit Bein HaBetarim, the covenant with Abraham, in the context of another program that we did about where does Abraham come from. By the way, I did not know Haran was actually Turkey. So it was quite interesting to me to kind of. So God promised Abraham, the generations after you will be as large as, and he talks about the stars and the sand. He talks about the land that we will inherit and the geography neither of those have really come true.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that the Jewish story has not ended. It's in process, but there is a great deal that has been spoken about that has come true before our eyes, which is quite staggering, actually. Again, I speak for myself in saying it. Astonishing, really. So it's a story that is yet unfolding. And yes, there are parts of it that have not come to pass, but there's certainly a great deal that has, that we've seen with our own eyes.
In our last few minutes, can I ask you a few questions about your background, since we never met you before? So you studied with, did you study with Rabbi Ovadia Yosef? Did you have...
Yeah, well, my wife is his granddaughter, so I spent a great deal of time with him.
Okay.
And I did study with him, and so I came to know him very well.
Anything you can share? Because I would say most of us have only read about him, and maybe not even read great things about him, I would say, necessarily,
right?
Just because of
it was quite controversial.
Yeah. So is there anything you can share that we should know?
Sure. I know him as the man, not as the public persona, and he was a very sweet man and a very humble man. People might be surprised to say that, but he was not, in his home. He loved his family. He enjoyed playing with his grandchildren. He used to make his own pickles. He was very proud of that. We'd sit at the Shabbat table and he'd take his big jar of his pickles out and give it out to the family as they were sitting around the table. And he'd say in Hebrew, "Maaseh Yadai." He said, "The works of my hands." These are the pickles. He loved Arabic music. These are the things that people don't usually tell you about him. He loved Arabic music. He was an expert in the music. He loved singing. If we were singing at the table, he wouldn't get up. Usually he would get up and he would study. He was well known for studying hours on end. He definitely had a photographic memory. He had tens of thousands of books in his library, which I saw. He would literally knew where every single book was, and he knew what was in every one of the books. I've asked him questions and was just floored by how easily and quickly the recall was. Obscure questions. After a Friday night dinner, and he would just pull out a book, open it up, and point to the line for me where it was answering this obscure question that I asked. So, that about him was true. But he was a very personable man. He was a man that had a great sense of humor. He used to do after his wife Margalit passed away, he held a weekly Tanakh class for his children, which I used to attend. And I would watch him read the Tanakh. And the man, when he would read the Tanakh, he lived it. I mean, I saw him laughing uncontrollably when he was reading the story of David and Goliath. And Goliath says to David, he goes, "What am I, a dog that you're coming at me with a stick?" Because, David walks up to him, he's this little kid. And he just, I guess, was envisioning the scenario. And he was just laughing hysterically for 30 seconds, maybe over a minute. And I saw him cry when he was reading the stories of the prophets. He was a very sensitive man. He was a very passionate man, and he believed very much in a lot of the things that he held. And he was quite unpopular with some of the ideas that he had, but he was nonetheless not afraid. I mean, it's important to remember, we knew him, most people only knew him in the publicity at the end of his life, but remember that at 18 years old, he was already lambasted by the rabbinate in Israel because of things that he had taught and said. When he was in his 20s, they burned his first book. The Iraqi Jews were very angry that he argued with Yosef Chaim, the Ben Ish Chai, and they burned his books, made a bonfire out of it. Those things people don't know about him. He went through a great deal of backlash and ridicule and all kinds of attacks, and he held strong. So I don't agree with everything that he said or ruled in terms of Jewish law. Who am I to say whether I agree or not? That's only my personal opinion. But he was a very special man. He was a man who he was unique, absolutely unique, and had much more to him than just the the embroidered robes and the Turkish hat and the sunglasses. He was a well-rounded individual.
And your story, so you grew up in LA in a Sephardi family, I assume.
I grew up in LA in a Syrian Sephardi family. Very average. I mean, my family kept Shabbat, kept kosher, but otherwise we were very average, I guess what you would call a modern Orthodox family, but Sephardic nonetheless. And at 18, so I went to Jewish day school, and I went to a Jewish high school. I went to Eula, for any of you who know it. And at 18, when I finished high school, I went to study in his yeshiva, in Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's yeshiva in Jerusalem for 2 years. And then I got married at 20, got married very young. I've been married for 26 years, have 5 children. And I didn't want to be a rabbi. I was not interested in being a rabbi, really. I enjoyed studying Torah all the time. And so I wanted to kind of round out my study, but was not interested in being a rabbi. And I kind of fell into it accidentally, because when I went to finish my studies in Brooklyn, I ended up studying Talmudic Jewish law and philosophy fundamentally for over 10 years. I continue studying, but my formative study was over 10 years in the end. After I married in Los Angeles for 3 years, and then in New York for another 7. And I ended up filling in for a rabbi in a synagogue, and I never left. I ended up staying for 15 years. And that's kind of how I did it. And, here I am. I don't think I'm going to be doing it forever. But I say that, my wife laughs at me. She says, rabbis don't retire. But I think I might. So,
and our last really few minutes about life in a rabbi of a Sephardi community in London or in England.
It's remarkable, I have to tell you. My community, God bless them, they were the oldest Jewish community in the country. They were established in 1656. And they were just unique. People think of Sephardim and they think Middle Eastern, North African. These Sephardim, these Spanish and Portuguese Jews are very Western. So, you walk into our synagogue, we have a choir, the tunes, you close your eyes, you might feel like you're in high church for a lot of the tunes. I still wear a top hat every Shabbat, but it is it's a remarkable community, and a very, very well respected community. And so it's lovely. But I will say that Sephardic Jewry has a very special, specific approach to Judaism that over recent years has been the minority voice And so I'd like to kind of raise the volume on that voice a little bit, to be able to speak more in terms of the humanistic, pragmatic, world embracing approach that Sephardic Judaism has traditionally had. And so while I'm in the rabbinate for the time that I am, that's probably what I'd like to and continue to speak on and develop.
Thank you. We'll end with a deeper question. Howard Merowitz asks about the nature of covenant and God choosing to go into covenant, and then humans going into covenant. And given the nature of God, the nature of humans, is covenant doomed?
That's a wonderful question. So far, it's running. And that's been for over 3,000 years. So I don't know. I can't tell you. All I can say is that from our tradition and faith, we believe, as we've pointed out, that you can take God's word to the bank. And I do believe that the very fact that we are sitting here on this Zoom chat as Jews in Orange County in London, discussing the question of a covenant over 2,000 years after our exile from our homeland as a nation, is a miracle in and of itself. So if I were to bet, if I were a betting man, I would bet on covenant, because we shouldn't be here in reality. I mean, you and I, we shouldn't be here as Jews, being able to speak about Jewish things, considering Jewish questions. We take it for granted, but it is an absolute aberration that it occurs. We should be exhibits with the rest of them in the British Museum. So that's my bet.
Well, we'll end on that high note that we are going to go, when we go to England, to visit the museum and not see ourselves in there.
Please do.
Don't be
if you
upset.
do, make sure to get Rabbi Zarum as your tour guide, and I'll tag along. It's the best
think we will. We hope to get traveling sometime soon and come to England, given all of the great teachers we've met over the last 19 months. So thank you for spending time with us on this gray day here in Southern California. I think it's gray. Maybe it's sunny. And dealing with a heavy subject. Much appreciate. We hope to have you back, learn some more. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We have a lot of learning this week.
Thank you.
And interesting topics. Thank you for being with us.
Have a lovely week, everyone. Thank you so much. Good night.
Take care. Bye, Faith. Nice to meet you, Maurice. Rosa Berkowitz, nice to meet you as well. Please come back. Jennifer Malvin, of course, is a regular. Thank you. I'm going to spend time with my children, and if you're in Orange County and you're part of the Legacy Circle, I look forward to seeing you live at the Book of Endowment event this afternoon at 6 p.m. over in Irvine. So hopefully I'll see you guys in I don't know if Ada's coming, but hopefully I'll see you in person. Take care, everybody. Howard, see you soon.